Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker, Chapter 4, The Progression of Recovering. Subheading, Signs of Recovery. Effective recovery work leads to an ongoing reduction of emotional flashbacks. Over time, with enough practice, you become more proficient at managing triggered states. This in turn results in flashbacks occurring less often, less intensely, and less enduringly. Another key sign of recovering is that your critic begins to shrink and lose its dominance over your psyche. As it shrinks, your user-friendly ego has room to grow and to develop the kind of mindfulness that recognizes when the critic has taken over. This in turn allows you to progressively reject the critic's perfectionistic and drasticizing processes. More and more, you stop persecuting yourself for normal foibles. Additionally, you perseverate less in disappointment about other people's minor miscues. A further sign of recovering is a gradual increase in your ability to relax. With this comes an increasing ability to resist overreacting from a triggered position. This further allows you to use your fight, flight, freeze, and fawn instincts in a healthy and non-self-destructive ways. This means you only fight back when under real attack, only flee when odds are insurmountable, only freeze when you need to go into acute observation mode, and only fawn when it's appropriate to be self-sacrificing. An alternative way of describing this decrease in overreacting is that you have a good balance between the polar opposites of fight and fawn. As this becomes increasingly realized, you facilitate healthily between asserting your own needs and compromising with the needs of others. A further example of decreased reactivity is seen in a more balanced movement between the polar opposites of flight and freeze. This manifests as an improving equilibrium between doing and being between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system arousal, and between left and right brain processing. The importance of balancing the fight, fawn, and flight freeze polarities within yourself is explored in greater detail at the end of Chapter 6. Deep level recovery is also evidenced by you becoming gradually more relaxed in safe enough company. This in turn leads to an increasing capacity to be more authentic and vulnerable in trustworthy relationships. With enough grace, this may even culminate in you acquiring an intimate, mutually supportive relationship where each of you can be there for each other through the thick and thin. Advanced recovery also correlates with letting go of the salvation fantasy that you'll never have another flashback. Giving up the salvation fantasy is another one of those 2 steps forward, 1 step back processes. We typically have to wrestle with denial a great deal to increasingly accept the unfair reality that we will never be totally flashback free. Unless we do, however, we impair our ability to recognize easily and quickly respond to flashbacks from a position of self-compassion, self-soothing, and self-protection. Subheading, The Stages of Recovering. Although we often work on many levels of recovering at the same time, recovering is to some degree progressive. It begins on the cognitive level when the psychoeducation and mindfulness helps us to understand that we have CPTSD. This awakening then allows us to learn how to approach the journey of deconstructing the various life-spoiling dynamics of CPTSD. Still on the cognitive level, we take our next steps into the long work of shrinking the critic. Some survivors will need to do a great deal of work on this level before they can move down to the emotional layer of work, which is learning how to grieve effectively. The phase of intensely grieving our childhood losses can last for a couple of years. When sufficient progress is made in grieving, the survivor naturally drops down into the next level of recovery work. This involves working through fear by grieving our loss of safety in the world. At this level, we also learn to work through our toxic shame by grieving the loss of our self-esteem. As we become more adept in this type of deep level grieving, we are then ready to address the core issue of our trauma, the abandonment depression itself. Work here involves releasing the armoring and physiological reactivity in our body to the abandonment depression via the somatic work discussed in Chapter 12. This work culminates with learning to compassionately support ourselves through our experiences of depression. Finally, as we learn more about in Chapter 13, many survivors need some relational help in achieving the complex tasks involved in deconstructing each layer of our old pain-exacerbating defenses. I have designed a ground plan that has helped me, my clients, and website Subheading: Cultivate patience with the gradual progression of recovery. As stated earlier, recovery from CPTSD is complex. Sometimes it can feel so hopelessly complex that we totally give up and get stuck in inertia for considerable lengths of time. This is why it's so important to understand that recovery is gradual and frequently a backwards and forwards process. Effective recovery is often limited to only progression in one or two areas at a time. Biting off more than we can chew and trying to accomplish too much too soon is often counterproductive. As a flight type, I spent years in mid-range recovery workaholically, spinning my wheels, trying to fix and change everything at once. I describe this at greater length in the, quote, when recovery becomes obsessive compulsive, unquote, section of my first book, page 140-141. We often need to simplify our self-help efforts in early recovery. Accordingly, I recommend making Shrinking the Critic, Chapter 9, your go-to response if you feel unsure of how to proceed. Once the critic is reduced enough that you can notice increasing periods of your brain being user-friendly, impulses to help and care for yourself naturally begin to arise. As this happens, it becomes easier to tell whether you are guiding yourself with love or a whip. When you realize it's the whip, please try to disarm your critic and treat yourself with the kindness you would extend to any young child who is struggling and having a hard time. Nowhere is patience with ourselves more important than with the inner critic work. Typically, the inner critic is too omnipresent to confront on every occasion. To do so would often leave no time for anything else. But when we practice critic shrinking in a gradually increasing way over time, we can more consistently disidentify from its negative focus and switch to a more self-supportive perspective. Eventually, a new positive habit of rescuing ourselves from shame and self-hate takes on its own life. I still have my unfair share of flashbacks, but rarely do I ever side with my toxic critic. Any self-help practices that we are trying to make second nature often work in this way. When we practice enough, self-help starts to become a matter of common sense. It reverberates as right action and gradually takes on its own life as we attune to the true nature of our spirits and souls, which are inherently self-supportive. We also aid our recovery greatly by challenging the all or none thinking of the critic whenever it judges us for not being perfect in our efforts. Quote, progress not perfection, unquote, is a powerful mantra for guiding our self-help recovery efforts. Moreover, as recovery progresses, and especially as the critic shrinks, the desire to help yourself to care for yourself becomes more spontaneous. This is especially true when we mindfully do things for ourselves in a spirit of loving kindness. As such, we can do it for the child we were, the child who was deprived through no fault of her own. And we can do it because we believe every child, without exception, deserves loving care. Finally, if the reader is like I was in the past and has no overall perspective on his suffering, he may feel like he is spinning his wheels on one icy patch of road after another. I had decades of trying everything under the sun with what felt like a deepening sense of futility and defectiveness. Gratefully, I eventually reached an invisible critical mass and realized I had actually come a long way. I had acquired quite a few pieces in this puzzle of recovery and only needed to organize them into a map to move along further. As such, I have designed a ground plan that has helped me, my clients, and website respondents to make sense of their suffering and to see how to effectively reduce it. I hope and pray that the cartography in this book will also offer you relief. Subheading: Surviving versus Thriving. Recovery involves learning how to handle unpredictable shifts in our inner emotional weather. Perhaps the ultimate dimension of this is what I call the surviving/thriving continuum. Before we enter into recovery, it may feel like life is nothing but a struggle to survive. However, when recovery progresses enough, we begin to have some experiences of feeling like we are thriving. These may start out as feelings of optimism, hopefulness, and certainty that we are indeed recovering. And then, the bottom inevitably drops out because recovery is never all forward progress. Oh so unfairly, we are back to feeling that we can barely survive. To make matters worse, we are amnesiac that we even had a respite from surviving. Another flashback has hit, and we polarize back onto the surviving end of the continuum. We are stuck in the anxious and deadened feelings of the abandonment melange. In survival mode, even the most trivial and normally easy task can feel excruciatingly difficult. As in childhood, it is all feels just too hard. And if the flashback is especially intense, thanatos may start knocking down the door. Thanatos is the death urge described by Freud, and in the flashback it corresponds with the suicidal ideation we looked at in Chapter 1. Once again, it is important to repeat that this feeling state is a flashback to the worst times in childhood when our will to live was so compromised. As mindfulness improves, we can recognize suicidal ideation as evidence of a flashback and begin to rescue ourselves with the Chapter 8 flashback management steps. As recovery progresses, polarizations back into survival mode do not take us to the utter despair end of the continuum so often. Nonetheless, survival mode can still feel pretty awful, especially when it is characterized by high anxiety or immobilizing depression. Being in survival is especially difficult during those times when flashback management is less effective, and feelings that life is a struggle can hang on for days and even weeks. This is the territory where flashbacks morph into extended regressions. I believe regressions are sometimes a call from our psyche to address the important developmental arrests. In this case, it is the need to learn unrelenting self-acceptance during a period of extended difficulty. It is also the need to develop a staunch and unyielding sense of self-protection. This fundamental instinct of fiery willingness to defend ourselves from unfairness needs to strengthen progressively so that we can withstand inner critic attacks. Moreover, we can grow in our ability to survive, quote, survival, unquote, by using the Chapter 13 mindfulness techniques to practice and build enduring self-compassion. Moreover, if we are far enough along in recovery to have a safe ally, we can enlist their support to help us verbally ventilate out our pain at being stuck in survival. Temptations can be great at such times to revert to the less functional ways of self-soothing that we learned when we were younger. Depending on your 4F type, this commonly manifests as increased eating, substance abuse, working, sleeping, and/or sexually acting out. Sometimes we are triggered into self-medicating in this way because we are desperately trying to keep ourselves on the thriving end of the continuum. Desperately clinging to thriving is a hard impulse to resist, even when we are in reality way past its expiration date. Yet as recovery and mindfulness increase, we begin to notice that this type of self-medicating indicates that we are in survival flashback. We are no longer authentically on the thriving end of the continuum. We have compounded our regression by regressing further by self-medicating to unnaturally prolong a preferred experience. At such times, we benefit most by re-invoking our intention to practice self-acceptance, by recommitting to being there for ourselves no matter where we are on the continuum. As bears repeating, all human beings are existentially challenged to handle disappointing shifts out of thriving into surviving. We survivors, however, have greater difficulties handling these transitions because we're abandoned for so long at the surviving end of the continuum. Yet as our recovery progresses, we can learn to become increasingly self-supporting in times of being stuck in survival.